Hello, unstoppable vegans. Welcome. I am Anita, also known as the Vegan Mindset Coach. I created Unstoppable Vegans as a private Facebook group to be a safe space for vegans to unpack our relationship with the non-vegan world, and also as a place to help and support each other to survive and thrive in that non-vegan world while being effective advocates for animals and for ourselves. I do these live trainings weekly inside the group to give us the skills and tools to do just that. Now, up to this point, the recordings of these training sessions have only been available inside the Facebook group. From this training forward, I will also post the recordings on YouTube. And that's where, if that's where you are watching, this will be the first video that you see. So welcome. Okay, let's recap carnism. Carnism is simply the invisible belief system that conditions people, good people, to consume and exploit some species of animals, but not others. Okay, so carnism is invisible. It's an invisible belief system because people aren't aware of it and don't realize that they are actually being conditioned by it. Now, almost all of us were born into this invisible belief system. So unless we were lucky enough to be born to vegan parents, of course. Now, carnism is a dominant and an oppressive belief system. And it's dominant because most people and institutions operate under its rules. So this includes our legal, our medical, and our educational systems, and of course, all of our governments. And it's an oppressive system because it relies on the oppression of one group, which is the exploited, abused, and displaced non-human animals, to the benefit of another group, which is humans. Okay? So other examples of dominant oppressive systems include racism, sexism, and ableism, just to name three. Okay, so dominant oppressive systems remain invisible until people start to call out the injustices perpetrated by them. When they do, that is the start of a counter movement. Okay, it is the counter movement that gives a dominant oppressive system its name and thereby makes it visible for the first time to the people participating in those systems, right? So the civil rights movement, for example, was the first to name and bring attention to racism. And it took feminism, the feminist movement, to name and call out sexism. And it is now the counter movement of veganism that is naming and creating awareness of the oppressive system of carnism. Okay, so all oppressive systems are propped up and protected by a set of cognitive distortions, which are simply inaccurate and biased ways of thinking, right, by the people who participate in these systems. And these cognitive distortions are underpinned by a set of myths that are taught to all of us, right, that we're all taught to believe and to never question from the earliest age. And this happens when we are born into a dominant oppressive system. Because the people who are our caregivers from when we're babies are all also believing in these myths and have these cognitive distortions already ingrained in them, and of course everyone else around them does too, and so do all the institutions that they interact and operate in. Okay, so because these cognitive distortions are reinforced by everybody and everything around them, we end up having these cognitive distortions so ingrained in our minds that we simply accept them as the truth. And when members of a counter movement then start making claims that are counter to our biased and inaccurate ways of thinking, our cognitive distortions, we simply dismiss them. That is the claims of the counter movement. We dismiss them and their claims as untrue, right? Because what we already believe just seems so much the truth, it can't possibly not be the truth when everybody else agrees. So even when we're presented with hard evidence against what we believe to be the truth, we manage to explain it away as an exception, right? As an exception that proves the rule. How often have we heard that? That just further then reinforces our cognitive distortion. And this explains all of that denial and rationalization and defensiveness and criticism that we receive from non-vegans when we try to share with them the true extent of the exploitation, the abuse, and the suffering of non-human animals who are oppressed by the system of carnism. Now, the good news is that we as vegans can learn to recognize and to identify cognitive distortions in others' minds when they are deployed in defense of carnism. Okay, so when we identify a cognitive distortion, we have the opportunity to expose it and to make it visible to the person who's actually deploying it, who's not even aware of it as a distortion, right? And we're quite likely going to be the first person who's going to be exposing this distortion to them, right? It might be the first time in their life that they actually start to question that belief or that distortion that they've simply internalized. Okay, so when we make a cognitive distortion visible to people, we weaken its power, right? We loosen its grip on the person's mind and they start to become more open to seeing the truth. And this, of course, is what happened for all of us who were once not vegan, but now are. And so over the next 6 weeks, starting today, I'm going to share each of the 6 cognitive distortions of carnism one by one, and the strategies and techniques that I use to help people wake up to them. Let's have a look at the first cognitive distortion of carnism. That is denial, right? Denial of the systematized exploitation, cruelty, and abuse that we as vegans are all too aware of, right? The distortion of denial is underpinned by a number of myths, but the overarching myth is that there is no oppression, only stewardship, right? So the things that people will say that reveals that they are deploying denial as a defense include statements like, I think the way we treat animals is actually okay. Okay, it's just, I think it's okay. Or they might say, slaughter these days is humane. The way we do things now is humane. It's not like the way it used to be. Or they might say, well, we have the highest standards of welfare and we implement best practice in animal husbandry. Okay, and what's another one? There are just a few bad people in these industries who abuse animals, and there are safeguards in place in the system to spot and to deal with them quickly and effectively. So there's not really a problem, right? And then my favorite that I hear far too often, because it makes me laugh, it's so ridiculous, is, well, we have to farm these animals and control their breeding and their freedom of movement, otherwise they would just overrun us and destroy the environment. So what do we do about it when people are coming out with these cognitive distortions and just stating these myths like they were self-evident truths? The thing about denial is that the ultimate antidote is bearing witness. Unfortunately, as long as people's carnistic defenses are intact, this is not as simple as just showing them footage or getting them to watch a documentary. We know because we've tried, right? So if we did that, if we just tried to make them see the evidence, we know will just bounce right off that shield of denial, and people just counter with a myth like, well, there are just a few bad individuals, right? This is just, this is just one example and it's so very rare. And then chances are that they will then accuse you, the vegan, of cherry picking those few bad examples and exaggerating the bad within the system and misrepresenting an otherwise ethical system and otherwise humane system, right? They might even say that animal rights activists staged or faked the footage, right, in order to bring the industry into disrepute. Okay, so what people will in fact do if they're just being shown evidence straight up when their defenses are up is they will shoot the messenger before accepting the truth, right? So that is the strength of these carnistic defenses. And it's really important for us to be aware of them, because then we will stop banging our head against that wall. Because I know that among our group members, this has been the biggest frustration and the hardest thing to understand, is how can like smart, reasonable, compassionate people deny the evidence that's right in front of their eyes? Okay. So what this means, of course, is that bearing witness needs to be preceded by openness to the truth and permission to receive the evidence that we have to offer them. Okay? And the way that we get to that point of openness and permission is by helping people to realize that the things that they have been stating as self-evident truths in defense of carnism are simply just myths. Right? That they are just lies that they have always believed simply because everyone else around them believes them too. And when we help people to realize that that's the case, we do that not by telling, again, not by telling them what the truth is, but by asking. Okay? So we do that by asking powerful questions when we hear them state a myth. And powerful questions prompt people to look within. It prompts them to search their own minds, their own memories for the facts and the evidence that their beliefs are based on. And of course, what we find is very quickly they realize the facts and the evidence don't actually exist, right? So what we want to do is, instead of bombarding them with our facts, we want to be asking them how they know that their facts and evidence is actually accurate. That's the key, okay? So my experience doing vegan street outreach has taught me that it doesn't take much questioning at all to break down the myths of denial. So I'm going to use the same myths I mentioned earlier, which are the ones I tend to hear a lot during these street outreach conversations, and I'm going to use them to demonstrate how I approach each of them when doing outreach, so that you too can take these common examples and get familiar with the kinds of questions you can ask to break down these myths. Okay, so let's start with the first one I mentioned, which was the way we treat animals overall is okay. Right? So this is a very vague kind of generalization that people make. It indicates that they probably don't really know much about how we really treat animals. Okay, so when people are vague, the way to bust that myth is to ask them to be specific. And so I will say something along the lines of, what specifically are you okay with about the way that we treat animals? Okay, and usually, well, they don't tend to really know, so any answer they give is still pretty vague. So we can then prompt them by saying something like, okay, just choose one animal that you eat and that you are okay with the treatment of. What is your understanding about what happens to them through their life? Okay, and we just get them to, like, okay, let's walk us through the conditions that animal is born into, what happens to them next, what happens to them next. Very quickly that reveals that people tend to really not know very much at all. Usually just what they've seen on mainstream television and in advertising, which of course is very far from the truth. Okay, so when they start to try to explain, they very quickly start to realize that they are really not sure about the things that they thought they were quite sure about, and that they in fact have a lot of knowledge gaps, which then of course informs us about the facts and the evidence that they do actually need to receive from us when they are ready to receive it. Okay, so let's take the next example, which is that we have the highest standards of welfare in the world, and we implement best practice in animal husbandry. Okay, so when people say this, I will again ask them to get specific, right? Because that's a very broad and vague statement that they've made. So I'll say, when you say higher standards of welfare and best practice, what specifically are you referring to? Okay, so getting them to describe the humane welfare practices that they actually know, right? Usually, again, they will realize that they really don't know. They don't know what they're talking about, right? Which again tells us what it is that they do in fact need to bear witness to in order to become aware. Okay, so a follow-up question might be something like, if they do mention any practices at all, to ask them, if those practices were happening to you, would you be happy? And invariably they're going to say no, because none of these things are acceptable for ourselves, right? So then we can ask, so what makes it okay for these practices to be happening to others if it's not okay to be happening to you? Okay. So often at this point, other cognitive distortions and myths will emerge, such as, well, animals don't feel pain, so it's okay. And we can deal with that later because that will come in a later training. But it's just a great way to start uncovering what else is going on for them. So how about humane slaughter, right? So if they say, well, the way that animals are slaughtered these days is humane, we get to ask them, so what does humane slaughter look like? Now, I can tell you that 99% of people are stumped by that question. They actually cannot think of a humane way to slaughter anyone. A few will sometimes say, well, putting them to sleep with a needle, right? Because that's what they know from when their companion animals get sick and get taken to the vet to be put to sleep. So they think that that might be a humane way that livestock animals, the animals that they eat, are slaughtered. And of course, that very quickly becomes apparent that that's not possible. That's quite easy to make them aware of in that moment. But beyond that, we can also ask, is it possible to, let's just say the needle option were possible, which it's not, is it possible to humanely kill someone who doesn't want to die, right? Even with a needle? If you didn't want to die and someone was giving you a lethal injection, would you call that humane? And of course, invariably they say no, because there is no humane way of killing someone who doesn't want to die. Okay, and so again, this is exposing those myths as just that. Okay, and then so there's a couple more, right? So when they say, well, there are just a few bad people in these industries and there are safeguards in place in these systems to stop them and to deal with them very effectively and quickly, so this doesn't happen much, we get to ask them, like, do you truly believe that? Right? Let's just be sure that they aren't just making a throwaway comment, because so often people will just make throwaway comments to fob us off. And if they do truly believe it, now we get to question, what are you basing that belief on? Now, usually they will very quickly realize that there isn't much of a basis. At best, they might say, well, because I've seen a few of these like scandals exposed on the TV, and if it's very rare and it rarely happens, there's very few of them, right? Then we know that that's a great opportunity to let them know that, hey, actually all of those scandals were exposed by, whistleblowers and animal rights activists. They didn't emerge because the industry is onto things, right? So then we also get to ask this follow-up question of, well, if the industry has effective systems for spotting and dealing with cruelty, why do you think that whistleblowers continue to go to great personal risk to document and expose cruelty cases in these industries instead of just reporting them via the standard process? Right, so there's another one. And then finally, my favorite one, right, when they say, we have to farm these animals, otherwise they would overrun us and destroy the environment. Well, this is too easy, isn't it, right? Because it's very easy to ask, well, how do these farmed animals actually come into existence? And surprising to me, 100% of people have said, because we breed them, right? That's how they come into existence. So everybody knows that we're breeding these animals into existence. That immediately disqualifies that myth, right? That we have to breed them in order to keep them under control, right? So because if we don't breed them, what would happen to them? And I asked that as a follow-up question, like, what if we stop breeding them? Everybody says, well, they would die out. They would stop existing, right? Okay, and then we get to explore that with them. Is that good? Is that bad? What would be the impact on the environment if that's what you're concerned about? What would be the impact on the environment if we stop breeding these animals? Again, that very quickly reveals their knowledge gaps. Okay, that is how we help people to start thinking for themselves. These are not easy questions for them to answer, and it does cause them to think deeply. As they start to realize their knowledge gaps, they become open to having those gaps filled, because humans don't like not knowing stuff, right? So they become open to having their knowledge gaps filled with actual knowledge, actual facts. So at this point, it's really helpful to ask people for permission before sharing our facts. to make sure that they are in fact ready to receive them, and that our evidence doesn't just end up bouncing off their shields of denial, right? Because that would just be a waste of time, our energy and our efforts. So how do we get permission? It's very simple, because at this point they're feeling a little bit kind of dumb and exposed, like, oh, actually don't know. It's nice to give them a little bit of compassion to say, hey, that's okay. I was once where you were. I thought these same things. Just so that they don't think we're like, all judgy and superior and sort of laughing at them. But then what we get to do next is to ask for permission. And that is as simple as saying, hey, would you be willing to see the actual process that this animal would go through in their lifetime? Or would you be willing to see what the standard husbandry practices look like in that industry? Would you be willing to see the normal standard way that animals are slaughtered? And if they say, no, I don't want to see, that is not the end of the conversation right there, right? That's actually not a bad place to be, because it gives us the opening to further curiosity, right? And the opportunity to keep creating awareness with them. Because when we say something like, what is preventing you from wanting to see this, right? To actually see the truth? Almost always what people will say is, it's going to be upsetting, right? At this point, they have shifted from saying, nothing bad is happening, nothing to see here, denial, denial, denial. They've shifted from that to saying, I know it's actually horrible and upsetting, and that's why I don't want to see it. So that is an enormous shift, because we have now moved them out of that stage of cognitive denial, right? So, of that cognitive distortion of denial, right? We have loosened its grip, and we've managed to dispel a whole bunch of myths associated with it. So I call that success. Now, of course, what happens next after the cognitive distortion of denial is weakened is that people reach for the next carnistic defense. And that is typically the cognitive distortion of justification. Because when they no longer can deny that the system is bad, they feel the need to justify why it's necessary. Okay? And for that reason, the cognitive distortion of justification is the one I'm going to cover next in our next training, and I hope to see you back here for it. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can be notified about the next video. Thank you for joining. Really appreciate you. See you back here next week. Bye for now.